We're going to read this morning from Genesis chapter 8, verses 1 through 7. We're going to pick up the story of Noah and the ark right after the flood has ended. So all of what we normally read with the story of Noah, the building of the ark and the flood, God closing the door, all of that has happened already. Where we pick up our text, we're going to read in Genesis chapter 8, verses 1 through 7. The title of the message today is, "This is a Test." Verse 1 begins, "But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. After 40 days, Noah opened the window he had made in the ark, and he sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the waters had dried up from the earth." Do you remember that beeping sound that used to come on television? Sometimes you'd be watching a program and all of a sudden you'd hear that beep, and it would say, "This is a test of the emergency broadcast system." That actually began as a means to ensure that in the event of war or some type of nuclear event, that the President of the United States would have the means to communicate with the American public. And so periodically they checked that system to make sure it was still working. It was later expanded to include natural disasters and the like, to allow the President or the governor, whoever, to communicate with people during a disaster. But that phrase, "this is a test," has always stuck with me. What we read about when we read the story of Noah, among other things, we're reading about a test that Noah was given. The verse in our text this morning, verse 6, when it says that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and you remember earlier, of course, in the story of Noah, that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. That number 40, whenever you see that in the Bible, that's an alert to you to say, this is a test. Every time you see the number 40 in the Bible, somebody is being tested. I wrote down just a few examples. The Bible's filled with them. Moses lived in Egypt, you'll recall, for 40 years. Then he lived as a fugitive in the desert for 40 years. Then he wandered in the wilderness with Israel for 40 years. Moses was on Mount Sinai with God for 40 days and nights before he received the 10 Commandments. Before Israel inhabited the Promised Land, the spies searched through the Promised Land for 40 days before they gave their report. Jonah warned Nineveh that they had 40 days to repent before God's judgment. Israel was delivered into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Jesus was tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights before Noah, or after Noah completed the ark. And here in our text today, Noah waited 40 days after the rain before he opened the window. The fact, and that's not an exhaustive list, there are many others in the Bible, the fact that this number and its significance occurs so often in the Bible tells you something about how God operates. When I was in school, I would have teachers, and you probably did too, who from time to time liked to give what they called pop tests. Now these weren't the big tests that were announced that you knew they were coming. These were the ones where you just showed up for class one day and the teacher said, "All right, everybody, put your books away, take out a piece of paper, we're going to have a pop test." And it was to measure how you were doing in that subject at that particular time. And you see this throughout the Bible, God giving people tests. God uses the events of life, and usually they are difficult events, they're stressful, trying events. He uses them to test us. I don't know if he's necessarily testing us to know, to gather information for himself, or if it's so that we'll know how we're doing. We looked last week in Deuteronomy chapter 8, you remember, where Moses was telling the children of Israel to be faithful and remember God before they went into the promised land. And that text told us that this was a test for them. I don't know necessarily that God was testing the hearts of the children of Israel because he didn't know their hearts. I think he was testing them because they didn't know their own hearts. And you know, tests will do that. The tests of life, when they come, they let us know how we're doing spiritually. And so here we find Noah in the midst of a test. And think of what he had gone through in this great test. He had to labor for 120 years to build a giant ship out in the middle of the desert. And this was labor intensive. He didn't go down to the Home Depot every time he needed more lumber or more nails or a saw or a hammer. He was doing all of this with the primitive tools of his day. He endured the taunts of his neighbors and the other people who lived there. When I first read this story as a 16-year-old boy, when I really started reading the Bible on a daily basis, the first thing I thought about when I read the story of Noah was how much other people must have made fun of him. Wouldn't you? If one of your neighbors, especially if you lived out in the desert like Noah did, just started building a giant ship out in his yard. You know, as a teenager, you think a lot about that. You think a lot about what other people think about you, and you don't want to be that one that other people make fun of. So that really struck me as a teenager, that Noah must have been the source of a great deal of ridicule. And then when he finally did get the ship built, the ark built, and God closed the door and nobody else could get in, Noah was there with his family and all of those animals. Have you ever been in an enclosed space with even one animal for a prolonged period of time? And Noah was on board with countless animals, wet, smelly. Now, the question I ask myself today as I read this story, I don't have quite the same reaction to it that I had as a teenager. I see it a little more differently now as an adult, and the question I ask myself now as I read this story is, how must Noah have felt, not in relation to other people? What did the other people think about him? I asked myself how he must have felt in relation to God. And did he feel that God had singled him out for special persecution? Or did he feel at any point during those 120 years of building the ship and the months floating on the water, did he feel abandoned by God or neglected by God? You see, Noah's test was to be faithful to God, even while things were unclear to him. The book of Hebrews gives us that insight. In the 11th chapter of Hebrews, we have sort of a who's who of Old Testament characters, these great men and women of faith. The chapter mentions by name quite a few of them, and it mentions Noah. Listen to what it says about Noah in chapter 11, verse 7 of Hebrews. It says, by faith, Noah, being moved by the fear of God, made ready an ark, because God had given him news of things which were not seen at the time. You know, quite often God does that. He leads us and then asks us to be obedient to him even though we can't see where he's going. And it doesn't even make sense to us what he's asking us to do. And on top of that, Noah didn't know that it was a test. We know it now looking back on it. We know the number 40 there. We know its significance. We know it was a test. But when Noah was living it, he didn't. It would be so easy if God would just say to us, now look, all this stuff I'm putting you through, this is a test. I want to see how you do. If we just knew that, then we'd go, oh, okay. I'm going to be faithful, I'll be obedient, it's going to end eventually, and then God will see how well I'm doing. The difficulty is God never tells us it's a test. He just tests us. So yes, God does at times test us to see how we're doing, but he also uses the trials of life not just to test us, but to shape us and to help us grow spiritually. It seems like a contradiction to us for some reason that a God who loves us would either put us through tests or he would allow us to go through them. We feel like he ought to be protecting us from the trials of life. If God loves me, why would he allow me to go through all of these difficult things? But do you know, if you will look back on your life, you will probably see that the greatest periods of growth, spiritually speaking, in your life came during and after great trials in your life. The writer Henry Fielding, who lived in the 1700s, said this: adversity is the trial of principle. Without it, a man hardly knows whether he is honest or not. I think he was right. And not just about being honest, about anything. We don't really know who we are and what we are until we've been tested. And the Bible teaches that God is at work in all of the difficulties that we go through, whether he sends them or just allows them. The one thing we always know is that he's at work in them. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says that we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That means God is always at work in your life and in mine to make us into what he wants us to be. And in order to do that, some difficulty has to come into our lives. I like cake. I think everybody probably likes cake, right? But if you've ever made a cake from scratch now, not the kind you make out of the mix, you know that some of the things that go into the cake by themselves taste pretty good, like sugar, for example. It tastes good. But you can't make a cake just with sugar, or just with vanilla, or just with chocolate. You also have to add baking powder, for example. And if you've ever tasted baking powder by itself, it doesn't taste that great. If you've ever tasted baking soda by itself, it doesn't taste as bad as baking powder, but it's not that great by itself either. Or salt. Things that by themselves aren't that great, but the wonder of it is that when you put them all together, the flour, which by itself doesn't taste that great, but the flour, the sugar, the salt, the baking powder, the baking soda, the eggs, the vanilla, all of that stuff, you put it all together, and the end result is something pretty special, right? That's how God works through the events of our lives. If all that ever happened to us was good and sweet and light and pleasant, the end result wouldn't be very good. A mature Christian is, among other things, a Christian who has been tried and tested. And the person that God wants you to be, he can't do that unless he allows some difficulty to come into your life. I like to think of myself from time to time, and this may be helpful to you. You know how when you're driving along and sometimes you'll see a construction site that says, "Caution, men at work"? Or maybe sometimes there'll be a fellow out holding that sign. I like to think of that sign kind of over my head, but it doesn't say men at work, it says God at work. And it's a reminder to me that I'm still under construction. God is not through with me yet, not through building me yet, not through with my construction. And so I like to think of that picture up there, God at work. And so yes, sometimes God uses the trials of life to shape us and to help us to grow spiritually. Sometimes God uses the trials of life to bless us and to prosper us. Now, that on its face doesn't make any sense at all. But that is the strange calculus of God. the strange calculus of how God works, that he actually takes the difficult events of life and he blesses us through them. The difficult trials of life. Go back and think of the great characters of the Bible and how they were tested. Noah and Abraham and Moses and David and Job and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Paul and Peter and on and on. All of them were tested. Not one was destroyed by the test, and ultimately all were blessed by the test. They were strengthened and refined through the fiery trials that they went through. I was reading a while back about a young woman named Wilma. She lived, an American woman, lived at a time when kids were still getting polio, and she contracted polio as a young child. She didn't have a horrible case of it. It didn't leave her completely crippled, but it twisted her left leg, and it turned her left foot inward so that it was very difficult for her to walk. She had to wear a brace on her leg for 7 years to try to straighten the leg out. After 7 years of this brace and painful therapy, she could finally walk without the braces. When she was 12 years old, she tried out for the girls' basketball team at her school, but she didn't make it. So she started practicing every afternoon with another girl who was on the team and 2 boys. She figured that would help her get better, going up against bigger, stronger boys. And so she did that for a year. And the next year she went out for the girls' basketball team and she made it. A college track coach happened to be at the gymnasium watching this girls' basketball team play one day, and he was impressed by this young girl, Wilma. And he thought he saw some potential in her, and so he offered to train her for free. And by the age of 14, Wilma could outrun any woman in America. In 1956, she tried out for the U.S. Olympic team and made it, but she did very poorly at the Olympic Games. Undeterred, she kept practicing, kept trying. She made the Olympic squad again in 1960 in Rome, and there Wilma Rudolph, and some of you remember that name, she won 3 gold medals, the most at the time that any American woman had ever won. And it's a reminder to us that where you are at any particular point in your life, especially when you're struggling, is not where you're going to end up when God is involved. Wilma could have looked at her life as a 7-year-old girl wearing braces and felt like, look how bad my life is. She could have looked at her life as a 12-year-old girl who couldn't even make the girls' basketball team and thought, look how bad my life is. Look how messed up my life is because I had this disease and because my leg is twisted. But she kept persevering, she kept working, and what was in the beginning a curse became a blessing because it made her work harder and try harder and practice longer. God allows similar trials into our lives because ultimately He wants to bless us and to prosper us. And He knows that one of the best ways to do that is through the trials of our lives. What I want to tell you today is that a big part of living a successful Christian life is just hanging on until things get better. It would be great if God gave us a better understanding of our trials. That would be great, but it's not really what we need. What we need is just greater faith to hold on during the trials and to say, God, I don't know where you're going with this, but I'm with you. I'm along for the ride, and I know that as long as you're with me, it's going to end up in a good place. Troubles are part of life. That's a universal rule, but troubles don't last forever. Eventually they end, just like they did with Noah. The rain eventually stopped. Look at what verse 6 says. and it came to pass. That is to say, after all the rain, after all that stuff that Noah had gone through, and it came to pass, things changed. The rain stopped. Everything changed. Do you know that phrase, and it came to pass, occurs 452 times in the Bible in the King James translation? It came to pass, the water subsided, life returned to normal, and when it was over, then and only then did Noah see what God had been doing all along. I read recently about some members of an adult Sunday school class in the church. They were talking to one another, asking to share their favorite verses for times of disappointment. And one man said, "My favorite verse when I'm sad or troubled is Psalm 23:1. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." One woman said, "My favorite verse in times of trouble is Psalm 46, verse 1. God is my refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble." Another woman said, "My favorite verse in times of trouble is John 16:33. Jesus said, in this world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." And then one old man in the class said, "My favorite verse in times of trouble is Genesis 8:6. And it came to pass." And he went on to share that, he said, "When I was 30 years old, I lost my job. I had 2 hungry children to feed and a wife to support. I didn't know how I would make it. At 45, my oldest son was killed overseas in the war. That really knocked me down." He went on to say, "When I was 60, my wife got cancer, and it slowly ate away at her. I spent many a night on my knees in prayer. She died 5 years later when I was 65. And the agony I went through in each of those moments was almost more than I could bear. But each time I looked in the Bible, I saw one of those verses that said, 'And it came to pass.' And I felt that God was telling me my pain and my circumstances were also going to pass, and that He would get me through it." Boy, that's deep, and that is profound. Ask God today to just give you the faith to hold on. Even when you don't see where He's going, you don't know what He's doing, don't pray for deeper understanding as much as you pray for God, just give me deeper faith. Give me greater faith to trust in you. I love verse 1, the way our passage began. But God remembered Noah. I love that verse. No matter what you're going through right now and how tempted you might be to feel that God has forgotten you, as I'm sure Noah felt, remember that verse, but God remembered Noah. No matter what you're going through today, God remembers you. He may be sending you a trial to test you. He may be sending you a trial to strengthen you. He may be sending you a trial to bless you and to prosper you. But whatever's going on, He's right there with you. Just hang on till things get better. We're going to sing our song of invitation this morning, hymn number 447, Trust and Obey.